The dust hadn't even settled when they abandoned her, leaving her trembling on the gritty earth with nothing but the echo of their cruelty clinging to the wind. Shame burned her skin, but fear ran deeper, until a shadow cut through the sunlight, steady and unhurried. A lone cowboy stepped forward, eyes carrying a storm he'd been riding with for years. He didn't ask what they'd done. He already knew. He just shrugged off his weathered coat, wrapped it around her shaking frame, and spoke in a low, irrevocable drawl that changed everything. "You're coming with me." Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The dust still swirled in the wake of the horses that had carried her in-laws away, their silhouettes shrinking into the shimmering horizon as she knelt on the gritty desert floor with a taste of fear thick in her throat, her breath unsteady, her skin burning not from the harsh sun but from the humiliation they had forced upon her. She clutched at herself instinctively, trying to hold together the last scraps of dignity left to her as the wind whispered over her bare shoulders, carrying the echo of their cruelty like a taunt she could not outrun. And just when she thought the world had decided to abandon her entirely, a shadow lengthened across the sand, deliberate, calm, unhurried, a lone cowboy emerging from the wavering heat, boots crunching softly as if even the ground beneath him recognized the gravity of his presence, his silhouette framed in the blinding light, giving him the look of a man who had crossed too many miles, too many memories, to be startled by whatever sight awaited him. He paused only long enough to understand the scene in front of him, and though his face revealed nothing, his eyes carried a storm, old pain, old promises, old ghosts. Before he reached behind his saddle and pulled free a weathered coat, the cone shaped by years of dust, wind, and silence, and without asking her a single question, without forcing her to relive a moment she already wished she could carve out of time, he stepped close enough for her to feel the shade his body cast, draping the coat around her shoulders with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence that had brought her to this moment. She looked up at him, trembling, her voice trapped somewhere between a sob and a breath, the coat heavy with the scent of sun and leather and something steady enough to keep her from collapsing. And though her instinct was to shrink, to hide, to fold herself into the smallest shape possible, the warmth of the fabric gave her a fragment of safety she had been denied for far too long. The cowboy's jaw flexed as he glanced toward the trail where dust still lingered, as if he could see every intention her in-laws had left behind. And when his gaze returned to her, it held no pity, only a tempered fury that simmered beneath the surface like coals waiting for wind. She struggled to speak, words catching in her throat, but he shook his head softly, not unkindly, as if telling her she didn't need to explain anything. Not now, not like this, and his silence became a refuge instead of a void. Then, with a subtle tilt of his head, he offered her his hand, not demanding, not assuming, simply offering. And though fear made her hesitate, something deeper, something old and instinctive, urged her to take it, her fingers curling weakly around his as he pulled her to her feet with surprising care. Her legs wobbled beneath her, the world spinning for a heartbeat, and he steadied her with one arm while keeping his eyes fixed outward, scanning the horizon as though expecting danger, or perhaps remembering it. He guided her toward his horse, moving slowly so she wouldn't stumble, his coat wrapped tightly around her trembling form as if it were a shield. And the further they walked from the place where she had been left, the more the shame she carried began shifting into a quieter ache, still sharp but no longer suffocating. When they reached the horse, he lifted her gently into the saddle, adjusting the coat around her again to ensure she was covered, protected, seen not as a broken thing but as someone worth saving. And as he placed a steadying hand near her knee, he finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, and weighted with an authority forged in fire and loss. "You're coming with me," he murmured, not as a command but as a promise, one she didn't yet understand, one he wasn't sure he could keep, yet one that altered the desert air around them as he swung into the saddle behind her, nudged the horse forward, and carried her away from the ruin she had been left in and toward a fate neither of them could foresee. The horse moved with the patient rhythm of a metronome, hooves whispering over sun-baked earth while the cowboy kept them angled away from the road that still held the shape of her ruin. She pressed into the coat as if heat and leather could seal the wrongness back inside, hands clinging so tight the leather creased, breath hitching on memories she did not want to name, and at first every gust of wind made her flinch as if the world itself might reach for her again. But the animal's steady motion, the cowboy's careful, economical shifts in weight, and the muted language of two riders in sync began to loosen the grips of panic into something thinner, suspended, watchful, not yet trospect closer to it than surprise would allow. He kept his eyes scanning the horizon, a slow, methodical sweep that told her he was cataloging threats and empty spaces alike. He kept his distance in speech but not in action, fingers light on the reins, a hand once in a while light and solid at the small of her back to steady her as the trail tilted or a rut threatened the horse's stride. And every touch was deliberate, not possessive, an expert measuring of space and safety rather than an attempt to own or soothe with words. Tears came when the first canyon wind hit them. She did not try to hide them. He did not ask for their meaning. Instead, he slowed the horse, let the animal walk a path of broken shadow beneath juniper and scrub, and the cadence of hoofbeats became a new kind of counting heartbeats, counting breaths, counting the small intervals between panic and possibility. She spoke once, a fragment, her name, muffled against the collar of the coat, and he answered with his own in a voice that was low as gravel and twice as honest. And that was all the dialogue they allowed themselves for a long while. No explanations, no accusations, only the present breathed between them in the plain grammar of survival. As the miles unfolded, flashbacks came like sudden, unwelcome mirages, faces, vows, the hush that had meant coercion more than peace. Each image made her flinch anew, but the cowboy's steady presence acted like a lighthouse, cold and fixed, not chasing away the dark but giving it a place to be measured against. He was not talkative. The silence between his words held weight and intention, a kind of grammar where restraint itself communicated care. When she tried to stand too tall inside herself, to demand that the world explain itself, he would press the horse into a softer pace and brush a thumb over an unseen seam of her sleeve, a small physical punctuation that said, "Not yet." As the sun slid lower, painting the mesas in bruised gold, she learned to write his rhythm. Inhale on the dip, exhale on the rise, let the horse bear what she could not, accept the coat's rough comfort. The cowboy, whose past seemed wrapped in the same stitched leather he offered her, showed glimpses of something heavier than duty, a private resolve carved in small gestures, keeping watch at dusk, shifting his jacket to block a cold gust, scanning for tracks where she refused to look. At one shallow river crossing, where the water hissed like a remembered anger, he halted and turned so the setting light caught the hard planes of his face, and for a breath she saw the outline of a man who had known loss, who understood wrongs that left no visible scars but made a home out of vigilance. He did not offer easy absolution, only company, and insistence that she need not face the remainder of her day alone. She began, imperceptibly at first, to match his small rhythms, a steadier seat, fewer quick breaths, hands unclenching, the weight of shame shifting from the center of her chest to something she could carry beside the memory, not inside it. The landscape, vast and indifferent, bore witness. The sky, enormous and without promise, folded into a palette that eased things into perspective. She had been taken and left, but she was also being taken somewhere else, somewhere with a man whose silence felt like scaffolding rather than a wall. And as night bled down the ridgelines and stars peered out like distant witnesses, the first fragile thread of trust had been spun, taut and tremulent, between two people who had met at the edge of ruin and chosen, for reasons they did not yet name, to ride together into an uncertain dark. The canyon side as they rode beneath its slip, a cool breath that took the edge off the day's heat and wrapped them in a hush where even the horses' hoofs seemed to lower their voices. And finally, when the world narrowed to sandstone walls and the cowboy's silhouette carved a private shadow across her, she let a name slip out, small, nearly swallowed by the coat at her throat. It landed between them like a fragile lantern. Mara. He listened as if the sound mattered more than any story she might have offered. For a long second he said nothing, the silence moving around them like a living thing. And in that silence she heard the rustle of his own history, the reluctant settling of something he had been carrying for years. Then he answered, but the name he gave carried weight that wasn't casual. It arrived after a pause so long it felt like an unspoken measurement, a calculus of whether to claim kinship or remain a passing shadow. Silas. The syllables fit together like two weathered stones found in different beds of a river, smoothed by separate currents. familiar when finally placed side by side. Their exchange was brief. There was no flood of questions, only the thin, urgent economy of two people who had learned that words can break as easily as heal, and so they let the names stand without explanation, each syllable a small covenant. As the horse picked its careful way through a wash, the canyon walls absorbing and returning their voices a half note lower, she watched him more closely than she had before, at the way his eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in calculation, at the way his mouth tightened as if biting some private sorrow back, and at the tremor in his jaw when the dusk made shadows of memory. He did not elaborate on his pause, but the pause itself spoke. There were doors in his past he preferred closed, rooms where the light had gone out and the furniture of regret had gathered dust. Yet he had given a name, and names are bridges. By offering his, he had moved the first plank into place. Mara felt something shift beneath the coat, not the weathered leather but a movement in herself, a small permission to be seen, to be named, to begin aligning her tremors with someone else's steadiness. Around them, the canyon offered private details, a carved notch that might have been a child's mark, a bird's call from above, a thin trickle that would be nothing in summer but now spoke of unseen springs, and those small things threaded through their silence, keeping it safe rather than empty. He told her nothing of his past in those moments, but he did perform a litany of quiet actions that read like confession. He tended the horse with hands that knew both tenderness and command. He rearranged his coat so it sat against her shoulders like a shelter rather than a shroud, and he kept his face turned outward more than inward, as if the world beyond the canyon demanded a vigilance that home did not. When she asked, finally, why he had stopped to help, he shrugged once, an economy of gesture he used as a language of its own, and said, simply, couldn't leave you. The sentence was not boastful. It was not righteous. It was a blunt acknowledgement from a man who had been shaped by failures and sudden mercies. Her gratitude did not arrive in a single speech. It arrived in the way she straightened, in the way her fingers eased their grip on the coat, in the way her breathing, previously erratic, found a measure with the horse's stride. In the amber light that filtered down the canyon, their names felt less like labels and more like the first small planks of a bridge that might one day carry heavier things, trust, truth, perhaps even a fragile affection neither dared name. Still, curiosity tugged at her, at the outlines of his life, at the shadow his pause had suggested, and when she pressed, asking about the scars on his hands or the far-off look that sometimes came into his eyes, he would not do more than nod toward the ridge and say, some things aren't for telling yet. The canyon seemed to approve of this restraint. Its walls folded around their hush, and for the first time since she had been abandoned, Mara experienced the modest miracle of not being reduced to what had been done to her. She was a woman with a name, seated behind a man with a name, and both names were now tethered to a shared, quiet geography. As night threatened the canyon's rim and the first stars pinpricked the sky, the smallness of their exchange, two names and a handful of soft gestures, felt enough to navigate by, a map made of human measures rather than cartographer lines. And when the cowboy shifted on the saddle and guided the horse deeper into shadow, Mara clung not only to the coat but to the sound of his name, and in that tiny retention lay the promise that whatever haunted him might one day loosen, and that her own story had, at last, found a witness. The canyon opened slowly into a broad stretch of sage and shadow, the air cooling with the onset of dusk as Mara gathered the courage to unspool the truth she had folded so tightly inside herself, her fingers knotting in the coat as though its worn leather might steady her trembling voice. And when she finally spoke, the words arrived in thin, halting strands that frayed at the edges. Her in-laws had punished her for what they called defying family tradition, a phrase she repeated with a bitterness that came from wounds no one could see but that lived in the way she winced at memories she wished she could bury in the desert dust. She explained that after her husband's death she had refused to sign away the small piece of land he intended for her, a plot he had said would be her safety if anything ever happened to him, and instead of honoring his wishes, the family had twisted his memory into a weapon, accusing her of turning against their bloodline, claiming she had no right to make decisions without their approval, their voices rising in those harsh, echoing rooms until she had felt smaller than the shadows that clung to the corners. Each detail came out with the cadence of someone who had learned to measure every confession, her voice cracking at the points where fear and humiliation overlapped. And Silas did not interrupt, did not soften the blow with hollow comfort. He simply listened, the reins loose in his hand as he let the horse pick its path, his profile cut against the reddening sky like something carved from quiet fury, his jaw tightening in increments that matched the deepening hurt in her narrative, not anger at her but a cold, focused rage at those who had treated her as though she were a possession to be corrected rather than a person to be protected. Mara kept her eyes fixed on the horizon as she spoke, unable to look at him for fear she might see pity. But when she finally dared to raise her gaze, she found none. Instead, she saw the hard gleam of recognition, the look of someone who had known injustice intimately and carried the memory of it the way one carries an old scar, felt but not flaunted. He said nothing for a long moment, and the silence wrapped around them like a solemn verdict, the canyon wind stirring only enough to lift a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. And still he did not offer promises or declarations. Silas was a man who guarded his words like a fortress, releasing them only when they mattered. And yet the way he tilted his head toward her, the way his eyes flickered with an understanding that went deeper than sympathy, told her more than any vow could have. She sensed the weight he bore behind that gaze, some private history of being dismissed, betrayed, overlooked, and though he did not reveal it, the shape of it lay in the tightening of his hands, the low exhale he released as if steadying himself against images from a long ago past. When she finally whispered that she feared her late husband's memory had been twisted into something unrecognizable, Silas shifted slightly in the saddle, his voice emerging in a quiet rumble that seemed to rise from the ground more than his chest as he said, "They had no right," a sentence sparse but absolute, an anchor thrown into waters that had been churning too violently inside her. She clung to those 4 words as if they were a rope, feeling something loosen behind her ribs, something long clenched beginning to release, and though he didn't outline a plan or swear retribution, the promise lived in the angle of his shoulders, in the way he guided the horse closer to the sheltering curve of the ridge, in the steady burn of his gaze when he looked back toward the trail they had left behind, as if memorizing it, as if weighing it, as if preparing for the moment when he might have to ride it again. Silas said no more, but everything in him, his silence, his posture, his fierce stillness, told Mara he had marked her suffering as though it were carved into stone, and in the vast, darkening landscape, that silent acknowledgement felt like the first real protection she had known in a very long time. The fire was small, just a careful scatter of coals and a single leaning flame that threw long, honest shadows across the scrub, but it performed a kind of miracle, turning the vast, indifferent dark into a room that could hold speech, and as night settled its blue hand over the land, Silas worked with the patient economy of a man who understood practical mercy. He cupped kindling, coaxed a spark, and tilted a battered tin cup to the embers to shield a glow, all while Mara sat wrapped in his coat, the leather smelling of saddle and sun and the faint, comforting trace of his sweat, and though the fabric could not erase what had been done to her, it made a small shelter of warmth around her shoulders, a promise in material form that someone had taken the measure of her pain and decided to stay. She watched him as he tended the flames. Watching became a kind of study for her, a way to catalog safety in small motions, and when at last the hiss of the desert night quieted enough for words to find purchase, she spoke with the halting bravery of someone naming a wound aloud so it would have shaped and therefore be survivable. She had tried, she said, to protect what her husband had left her, a crooked strip of land with more memory than value. The last thing he had pressed into her palm with a whisper that it'd be hers if he did not come home. And instead of the quiet honor she expected, she had found rooms full of appetite and rules written like shackles, relatives who read grief as an opportunity and turn the very memory of love into an accusation, who unmade his intentions with their talk of tradition and entitlement until her refusal to yield became a crime. The words came out in small pieces, names of rooms, the weight of signatures, the stiffness of faces in parlors that had once felt like safe places, and as she unspooled the tale, her throat tightened on the parts where betrayal had been most precise, the way they stripped her of more than property, the way their mockery sought to strip her of dignity, leaving her exposed in a literal and figurative sense that had hollowed the air out of her life. Silas listened without that clumsy attempt to fix things with platitudes. His face held a patient, dangerous calm, the sort that belongs to someone who has seen how easy it is for justice to be mistaken for vengeance and who therefore measures his response in small, deliberate increments. When she paused, expecting perhaps a question that would pry into memory too deep, he instead shifted a stick, fed the flame, and let the fire do the work of holding space while he considered his own answer. The thing he struggled with was not whether her hurt was real. that was visible as the ache in her ribs, but whether revealing his own history would help or harm. He had reasons to know the mechanics of family cruelty, the way it moved like an old illness through generations, and to lay them bare might invite confession, or it might drag a ghost into the open that neither of them could put back. So he battled with the option of silence versus the need to bridge the gap between two solitary survivors. If he told her about failures that had taught him caution, would she see him as less a savior and more a man carrying his own ruin? If he stayed mute, would she feel abandoned by a witness who might have done something more? In the pause, the fire crackled as if urging an answer, and when at last he spoke, it was in the small, economical language the desert had taught him. No dramatics, no sudden verdicts, merely the plain fact that he had seen this sort of cruelty before and that it had cost him in ways he had not yet learned to forgive himself for. He did not map out revenge or offer impossible guarantees. Instead, he described, with a restraint that felt like a promise, how he could watch, ride, and if necessary, stand between her and those who would take more. And in saying that, he let a piece of his guard itself slip forward, not the whole story of his scars, but enough that she knew she was not alone in her understanding of wrongs. The confession settled between them like a shared cloak, neither spectacle nor sermon. It was a compact forged in embers and restrained, and as they sat with the fire's low music, the night seemed less like an accusation and more like an ally, holding their small, fragile truths until dawn might decide what to do with them. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Dawn rose in thin, pale ribbons across the desert, the light stretching itself slowly over rock and sage as if reluctant to touch the rawness of the night they had survived. Silas was already awake, crouched low beside the horse with one hand pressed to the ground, the other brushing aside loose grit as he studied the earth the way some men read scripture. And Mara watched from where she sat wrapped in his coat, its weight draped like a fragile barrier between her and the world that had proven itself crueler than she ever believed possible. Her breath catching as she sensed something had shifted in his posture, some tension tightening through his shoulders like a bowstring drawn to low. He didn't call her over, didn't soften whatever he had discovered. Instead, he spoke with a grit-edged quiet that made her heart stutter. They doubled back, and when she joined him and saw the imprint for herself, the hoof tracks overlapping and confused, predatory loops, she felt a cold ache spiral through her stomach, because the marks in the dirt were not from riders passing through but from men circling, reconsidering, hunting, as though they had realized what letting her go alive might cost them. Silas traced one track with the blunt edge of his knuckle, jaw shifting in that restrained way she had come to recognize as the prelude to decisions he didn't want to speak aloud, his finger pausing where the ground bore a sharper indentation, heel pressure heavier, a sign of someone turning hard, someone frustrated or uncertain. He read those details effortlessly, instinctively, the way one might decipher the mood of a familiar foe. She clutched the coat tighter around herself, and the small, almost desperate movement traveled straight through him. She didn't see the flicker of memory that flashed behind his eyes, but he felt it, old scenes rising unbidden, the echo of someone else he hadn't protected well enough, a name he didn't speak anymore in a desert dawn that had once looked too much like this one. For a moment he battled himself, an internal war she could not see but could sense in the way he shifted his weight, in the way his shoulders rose with a breath too long held, as though he feared that by stepping between her and danger he might open the old wound he had spent years burying beneath silence and miles. Helping her meant choosing again, risking again, and the last time he had chosen someone in need. The ending had carved a scar across his soul that no campfire confession would ever erase. But then Mara shivered, the kind of involuntary, fragile tremor that came from fear mixing with shame, and she pulled the coat close like something holy, the leather bunching beneath her white-knuckled grip. And that was what broke the stalemate inside him. Not the tracks, not the threat, but the way she held his coat as if it were the last piece of safety she believed in, as though she trusted the man who had given it more than she trusted the bloodkin who had betrayed her. Silas rose slowly, every inch of him carved with a decision he had been trying not to make. He brushed the dust from his palms with deliberate finality and glanced again at the tracks, eyes narrowing not with fear but with a quiet, simmering promise that he would not allow those men to claim another piece of her life. He walked to the horse, tightening the cinch with movements more precise than necessary, every gesture a wordless declaration of intent. He didn't look at her when he said, "We move fast," but the low, certain tone told her everything. He had chosen, fully, irrevocably. Mara approached him, her voice barely a whisper, asking whether he thought her in-laws would truly come after her, and his answer was a slow nod, his gaze sharp on the horizon as if measuring distances and possibilities. But there was something else layered beneath that calculation, a vow, forming quietly behind his ribs, that whatever path this danger opened, she wouldn't walk it alone. The morning wind picked up, lifting dust into faint swirls around them, and as Silas offered his hand to help her mount, he didn't pause this time, didn't hesitate. Her fingers slid into his with a trust that felt fragile and immense, and when he lifted her onto the saddle, guiding her into the seat with steady hands, she felt the shift in him like the click of a lock turning. His past might haunt him, but protecting her was no longer a question. It was the answer. She rode with her hands folded small in her lap, watching the miles unfurl like old photographs, and when the sun slid a hair width across his knuckles, she saw them, pale ridges and thin white lines that read like a map of past collisions, and without meaning to, she found her gaze returning to those marks as if they might tell her a story faster than words could. Because scars, she had learned, are stubborn confessors. He noticed the attention and didn't flee from it. Rather, he let the horse slow, the animals breathing a patient metronome, and in that pause he unrolled a piece of himself that had been tightly bound for years, not in spectacle but in a voice low as river gravel and careful as a man counting steps across a bridge he did not trust. He spoke of a family that had been a geography of obligations and obligations that had become an atlas of compromises. He told her, without flourish, of a brother who had trusted him to stand and when danger came, and a sister whose hopes he had, in a single stubborn miscalculation, folded poorly beneath his good intentions, and the knuckles were the ledger of all those attempts. Spotted wood from a night trying to man defense for a woman who needed a door, leather torn when he reached for a child's runaway colt, a kitchen knife nicked when he tried to teach someone to slice bread without the hands shaking, and each mark held a small apology in its grain. Mar listened as the canyon around them seemed to lean in, the hush of distant hawks and the thin whisper of sage filling the space between one admission and the next. He did not parade guilt like a trophy, he described it like weather, inevitable, shaping everything over time. "I kept my back turned once," he said, and the sentence rested on the ground like a stone. "Should have ridden for them and I rode away." The confession was a simple ledger entry, not a sermon, a man recounting that he had chosen distance when closeness was what would have saved someone he cared for, and the shame of that choice had branded him with a habit of watching too long before stepping in. There was a particular cadence to his speech, short fragments, pauses like small catchments where he swallowed the worst of the memory before it could spill, and he gave her the hard facts of loss without sentimental framing. How a child's fever had been met with silence because his pride argued louder than sense. How a neighbor's house burned while he was stalled by a debt he could not break free from. How each failure left a line behind it until his hands looked like a map of the debts he could not pay. In telling her, he seemed to be naming the currency he used to weigh right and wrong, and Mara felt, in a sudden, unbidden way, that these were not the confessions of a man who sought absolution as much as a man who needed to calibrate the scale, so she could decide whether he would be a burden or a ballast in the days to come. She asked nothing that would force him to spill more than he intended. She did not press for dramatic details, because she had learned the hard economy of asking only what will help you move forward. Instead, her silence became its own question, and when he finished there was a pause long enough for the wind to rearrange the dust into new patterns. The truth of it settled between them, not a clean exoneration, not a justification, but a landscape of culpability he owned without pretending it wasn't heavy. His guilt, the slow, patient kind that returns in quiet hours and at dawn, became a new layer of the mystery surrounding him, making him larger not because he was more heroic but because he had chosen to live with what he could not undo. At times his voice cracked on the edges of regret, and she saw how the past had not only marked his skin but reshaped his choices, how he watched faces for the small betrayals fear makes habitual, how he measured distances before leaping, how his hands, scarred and careful, moved with a protective choreography learned the hard way. When he folded the confession into a single sentence, "I can't stop what was done, but I won't let it happen again," it sounded less like an oath and more like a rule he'd carved into bone, and Mara, listening, felt the shape of that rule as tangibly as the coat crossed her shoulders. It was not a promise of perfection, only a steadying of intent. In the slow heat of the afternoon, with the trail bending ahead and the canyon swallowing the last of light, the map of his scars read differently to her, not merely as evidence of harm given or received, but as proof that this was a man who had learned the cost of inaction, and that knowledge, heavy and weathered, might yet be the very thing to keep her safe. The light then toward evening as Mara unspooled memories she had kept folded like old letters, and she spoke of her husband not as a legend but as a quiet, failing weather, gentle in the ways that mattered, stubborn in the small mercies, and too often swallowed by the louder claims of kin and custom. She described how he would leave a loaf cooling on the windowsill for a neighbor's child, how he would sit with a tired horse until it breathed steady again, how he smoothed the edges of every quarrel more out of habit than bravery, and how that same habit, this constant yielding to keep peace, had become the lever with which his family pride opened her life after he was gone. Mara's voice trembled as she traced the slow arc of his final months. His hands grew quieter, his answers shorter, promises left half-built and filed away under chores and apologies, and when he spoke of leaving her the small strip of land he loved, he did so with a softness that meant safety to him but Rita's defiance to the house that raised him. As she talked, Silas listened the way a man reads the weather, by small signs, the way a lip tightens, the angle of a draw, and the pieces of the picture shifted under his palms until the motive behind the cruelty took on a shape he recognized. It was not merely anger at a memory kept or a woman who would not bend. It was greed disguised as tradition, a hunger passed down in polished parlors and whispered justifications until it sounded like law. The land her husband had meant for her was not grand, not worth a headline, but it was precisely the sort of thing families measured into their balance sheets of honor and possession, an acre that could be folded into a property deed, a boundary that could be erased by a signature, and once that small patch was lost, the quiet power of inheritance tightened like a noose around anyone who might think to step outside the family line. Mara's hands trembled when she named the ledger men who brought lawyers and polite threats, the sisters who leaned their smiles like razors, the cousins who kept accounts where kindness should have been recorded. She spoke of offers disguised as concern, of signatures pressed with hands that refused to meet her eyes, of the way respect had been weaponized into compliance. Silas felt each detail as if it were a new notch on a belted war, familiar weights that told him how the machine of family entitlement wound itself up and wound others down. He began to suspect, not with the heat of sudden outrage but with the slow, sure cold of someone who has seen patterns repeat, that they had not merely wanted her silenced, they wanted her erased as a rival claimant, a living reminder that a man's last wishes could be honored by someone outside their circle, and that possibility threatened the tidy order they profited from. In the pause after her confession, the canyon around them seemed to inhale. The horse shifted, a small, obliging sound, and Silas's face hardened not into vengeance but into resolve, because he understood now why they had stripped her in public, why the cruelty had been both humiliation and a message. Break her spirit, they intended to say, and the land's claim will follow. Mara lowered her gaze, grief and a stubborn defiance playing across her features, and he watched the way her fingers tightened into the coat until the leather whispered complaints. He did not offer platitudes, because words would be small next to what had been done. But he did pin together a plan in his mind the way a man stacks kindling, methodically, with an eye to what would catch and what would burn slow. He pictured rides taken at dusk, questions asked in the right places, witnesses found, and if that meant reopening the narrow, excruciating places of his own past, he felt the old ache stir, the one that had taught him both caution and the cost of turning away. When Marble finished, silence settled like a shawl, and in that hush his eyes met hers with a promise that was not theatrical but iron quiet. She would not be left to vanish under the weight of other people's claims, and whatever it took to answer their motive, truth, confrontation, patient unmasking, he would stand with her and measure every step beforehand, because the reason he understood so well was the reason he could not walk away. They made camp near a river that moved with a quiet authority, a ribbon of cold light that cut the dark like a promise, and as moonlight silvered the low of the water, Silas found himself sitting on a flat stone, the coat folded across his knees like a small, stubborn treaty, while Mara, her face washed in pale reflection, unwrapped and rewrapped the garment as if by arranging its folds she might reorder the night. He watched her not because he planned to speak, but because he needed to measure the weight of what he might do, and the problem uncoiled inside him with slow, inevitable logic. Escorting her to safety would mean drawing lines in the dust he had once avoided drawing. It would mean riding into the arc of his old failures and exposing the faint, aching scab of memory that had taught him to be cautious. But turning away would be a different kind of bloodletting, another life left to the mercy of people who sharpened tradition into a weapon. The river made a soft, impartial music as he thought, and the decisions he balanced were not abstract. They were carved in the faces of people he had known, in the small, intimate catastrophes that had taught him the cost of stepping in too late. He remembered the look in a child's eyes when he had chosen distance once, how the look had become a map of regret he carried like ballast, and the memory pressed on him now with a terrible clarity. If he stepped forward and failed, he would add another notch to the ledger of what his hands could not save. If he stepped back, he would also fail, but in a way that required no quick action, only the slow consumption of a conscience that would gnaw at him for years. Mara, sensing the angle of his thought though she did not name it, sat with a quiet that was not submission but calculation. She had seen men make choices like these and dress them in rhetoric, honor, prudence, prudence again, and she had learned to hear the human cost behind the words. As he weighed the options, her resilience became a presence in the air between them, not loud but steady, the way she straightened when the wind tugged at the coat, the way her jaw set when a memory passed too close, the small economy of her laughter when he made a practical joke at the horse's expense. These were not merely traits to admire from a distance, they were reasons to act. His conflict was not resolved by heroics, instead it was a ledger of obligations where every entry carried a counterweight, and the moon watched like an indifferent judge. He could imagine riding to town with her under his saddle, the two of them a visible rebuke to the men circling in the dirt, but that would involve confrontation, perhaps blood, and a reopening of doors he had learned to keep closed. He could imagine sneaking her away to some distant place, a quiet town where names blurred and deeds meant less, but that would be exile, effectively erasing her right to the land her husband had left to her. And he could imagine leaving her to fend for herself, which required a kind of moral cowardice that the scars on his hands still protested against. As the night deepened, he thought less in terms of one grand decision and more in small moves, a reconnaissance first, questions asked softly of neighbors and barkeepers, finding witnesses who could corroborate her claims, gathering papers and signatures, carving a legal foothold rather than charging into a shootout that would feed the very stories the in-laws wanted to tell. Each option had its danger and its dignity, and for the first time since he had carried silence like an old coat, the idea of combining caution with commitment felt possible. Protect but plan, defend but do it with care. Let the line witness and slow, steady pressure do to heavy lifting where violence would only play into the enemy's hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low as the river and steadier than he felt. "We do this my way," he said, and the words were both an instruction and a compact. Mar listened, the faint creases at the corner of her eyes softening, and when she nodded it was not a surrender but an agreement to a strategy shaped by the hard calculus of lived consequence. In that moment, responsibility shifted in him from a burden to a chosen shape, and hope, quiet, cautious, like the first thin light on the other bank, took its place beside it, a twin to resolve. Under the moon's witness, two people who had been stripped and scarred and made small by others began, with small, precise choices, to build a path that might one day lead not only to safety but to a restoration of what had been taken. And Silas felt, with a clarity that was both frightening and liberating, that this time he would not ride away. Dawn came like a long-held breath finally released, and for a heartbeat the desert seemed to listen. Then a sharp crack split the air and the quiet dissolved into motion. Silas moved with the kind of reflex that belonged to men who had learned to answer danger without time for calculation, grabbing Mara down behind the flank of the horse and pivoting his body so that whatever came would find him first, the coat cinched around her like an urgent, warm promise. Men float up from the low brush with the blunt efficiency of those who treat violence as business. Three figures, faces set in a practiced hardness, boots stirring just as if they meant to erase morning itself. There was no flourish, no theatrical raise of pistols, only the methodical click of metal and the hard approach of people who believed intimidation could finish what law or conscience would not. Mar felt the muscle of panic tighten inside her, but Silas acted before the panic had the chance to name itself. He planted his feet and met the first man with a block and a strike that held the authority of past cold nights and harder choices, the motion efficient and precise, a controlled ferocity that spoke of a history where quick, certain action had been the difference between keeping someone alive and losing them to slow consequences. The scuffle was ugly and brief. A knife flashed, a boot found purchase in the sand, a man went down hard and cursed, and bullets thudded into the ground, spitting grit, as one of the attackers fired wide in a clumsy attempt to command space. The violence was never described. There was nothing gratuitous about it. Yet there was a clarity to Silas's moves that made Mara register a new truth. This man's past held more violence than he admitted, not because he enjoyed it, but because it had been necessary at times when timidity cost lives. A splinter flew from a broken fence post as a blade struck timber, and Mara felt a stinging line along her temple where a branch had caught her as she ducked. It bled warm onto the leather of the coat, transforming the garment into a witness of the morning's cruelty and the morning's rescue. Silas sparked one short, iron-cold order, and the attackers, already shaken by the swiftness of his response and by the fall of their companion, hesitated. The pause he had counted on when studying tracks in the dirt, and then they melted back into the scrub, not in a dignified retreat but in a hurried withdrawal that acknowledged they had underestimated the man they had meant to intimidate. He urged the horse forward with a force that bent the animal into a flea born of necessity rather than panic, using knowledge of trails and hidden alleys to once pool distance between them and the men who had thought they could decide another's fate with threats and public humiliation. They did not ride away unscathed. Silas wore a pale bruise along his forearm where a knife had nicked him, a hot line that would darken over days. Mar found a shallow cut along her temple that stung with each blink but bled only for a moment, the cloth he offered absorbing the warmth into the fabric that had saved her. When the immediate danger had been wrung from the air, they drew into a lee of rock and scrubbed to assess the small violences the morning had left behind. There was no theatrical exchange, no grand declarations, only practical ministrations and a pair of hands that moved with a certainty born of long practice. He tore a strip from his shirt to bind the cut of her temple, his fingers steady though his jaw set where pain and containment met, and she pressed a cloth to his forearm where blood darkened the linen, each of them tending to the other with a quiet that felt, oddly, like promise. The ambush had stripped away any lingering fantasy that strategy alone could keep them safe. Danger had teeth, it had breath, and it had the inclination to come when least expected. Yet the attack also altered them in another, more intimate way. It forged the bond between them into something harder and more reliable, a metal hammered in fire. Mara, watching Silas trim a rag for her wound and then hold her hand while the blood stopped, understood with sudden clarity that the man who could move with lethal certainty could also move with necessary tenderness. His capacity for violence and his capacity for care seemed to come from the same root, an unwillingness to allow others to be left to suffer through the consequences of cowardice or greed. In the hush that followed, with the distant river murmuring like a witness and the horse's slow breath a grounding metronome, they sat close enough for the coat to lie between them, dust and the little blood staining its surface like a scarred treaty, and the morning's terror receded into a shared quiet that felt less like relief and more like the forging of partnership, imperfect, marked, and binding in ways neither had expected. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The trail wound upward into country where the wind carried the dry sigh of juniper and old secrets, and Silas rode in a silence that felt heavier than any wound from the ambush, his gaze fixed on a ridge that seemed unremarkable until the horse crested it and the land fell away into a small basin tucked between stone outcroppings. There, half devoured by sage and thyme, stood a cabin so weather-beaten it seemed unsure whether to remain upright, its roof sagging like an exhausted shoulder, its porch tilted, its windows clouded with years of dust and memory. Mara felt a shiver move through her, not a fear but recognition, for something about the place resonated with a quiet, aching familiarity, and when Silas dismounted and tied the horse to the lone, skeletal post, she saw the way his hand lingered on the reins, as if touching something that bridged his past and present. "Stay here a while," he said, voice barely above the wind, the understatement carrying a gravity that made her breath old. The cabin was a metaphor carved into wood, broken, forgotten, still standing because something in it refused to surrender. She followed him toward the door, the boards creaking under their steps, and inside she found a space barren but not empty. Scars on the wall where a lantern once hung, a dent in the floor where someone had paced too long, and a corner where ashes rested like the remnants of a fire burned for warmth rather than comfort. Silas paused near the hearth, his silhouette shaped by shadow and memory, and for a moment the quiet between them felt like the thin crust over a deep well. Mara realized then that the man who had shielded her with ferocity at dawn carried a softness he tried to hide, the kind of tenderness formed by surviving too much alone. She set the coat, his coat, across a chair whose legs wobbled but held, and she watched him move through the room with an intimacy that told her he had once lived here not out of choice but necessity, a refuge for a wounded animal rather than a home for a man. He touched the corner of the table, the edge of the doorframe, small gestures that spoke of nights when he had counted the seams in the wood to keep from counting his regrets. Wasn't running, he said finally, though she had not asked. Just couldn't stay where things went wrong. His voice carried a brittle honesty that made her chest tighten. She understood now why he studied distances before riding into them, why he measured every decision like a man who had once paid too high a price for choosing wrong. The cabin was his past written in timber, weathered but not collapsed, a structure betrayed by time but not by the man who survived inside it. Mara stepped closer, not to pry but to stand with him in the quiet, and her fingers brushed the dent in the floor, a small recess that seemed carved from pacing boots and sleepless thoughts. "You were alone here," she whispered, not as a question but a truth she felt in her bones. Silas didn't answer immediately, but when he lifted his eyes to hers, she saw something unguarded, something raw, a wound not bleeding but still tender. "I got used to it," he murmured, the words landing like an apology to himself rather than a confession to her. She realized with sudden, aching clarity that the man who had pulled her from humiliation and shielded her from bullets was a man who had learned to expect no rescue, no witness, no voice calling his name. He had built his life on endurance rather than connection, and endurance had taught him strength but also a loneliness that echoed in the rafters above them. Standing in that forgotten room, Mara felt a shift inside her, not gratitude alone, but recognition. He had saved her, yes, but he was a man in need of saving too, not through grand gestures but through presence, through letting someone stand in the spaces he had sealed off for years. She reached for the coat, lifting it gently, and placed it over his shoulders, a silent exchange, a mirror of the moment he had found her in the dust. His breath hitched almost invisibly, a small fracture in the armor he wore. The cabin, frail and stubborn, held the moment between them like a vow not yet spoken but already felt, and for the first time since dawn, both of them stood not as rescuer and rescued but as two weary souls learning that survival meant more one shared. The morning lights landed through the broken boards of the cabin, turning dust motes into drifting shards of gold, and Mara stood in the gentle radiance with a steadiness Silas had not yet seen in her, the coat pulled tight around her shoulders not as a shield now but as a mantle, something she wore with intent rather than desperation. And when she spoke her voice carried a resolve that startled even her. Quiet, yes, but firm enough to carve its shape into the air between them as she said she would not run any farther, not hide in the forgotten places of the world while her in-laws reeled her husband's memory and devoured the land he meant for her. And Silas felt the shift in her words like a tremor rolling along the ground. Not an outburst, but a declaration formed from pain hardened into purpose. He watched the way she planted her feet, the line of her jaw no longer trembling but set with a gentleness sharpened into conviction, and he understood that whatever softness she had been forced to live inside was no longer weakness, it was endurance turned into a weapon of its own. She explained, with a voice that grew stronger as she spoke, that running might save her body but would break the last part of her husband's legacy she still carried, the part that believed he had entrusted something meaningful to her, something worth fighting for. And Silas, leaning a shoulder against the warped doorframe, felt that familiar ache stir in his ribs, the old sting of choosing wrong once, of leaving someone to stand alone in a moment when what they needed was a hand, not a ghost. Her courage pierced him in a place still tender from the years he had spent drifting between towns, trying to outrun the guilt etched into the scars she had traced with her eyes. And as he studied her now, trapped, hunted, wounded but unbroken, he felt the slow, steady ignition of something that had been dormant in him, not pity, never that, but respect, the kind that alters a man's stance and his future in a single breath. Mara said she was done living as though her survival depended on the silence of men who had never cared whether she breathed at all. She said she would return, not with recklessness but with truth, and demand the world acknowledge what was hers by right and by promise. Silas's response came not quickly but with a deliberateness that matched the gravity of the moment. He stepped forward, boots creaking on the tired wood, and when he spoke his voice held the resonance of a man who had weighed every possible consequence and still chosen the path that would demand the most from him. He told her he would help her reclaim what belonged to her, not because he felt obligated or because he sought redemption, but because she had shown him a courage that made running feel like cowardice, and because justice, slow, patient, unadorned, had always mattered more to him than safety. The vow he gave was not flowery. It came in plain, tempered words, but the truth inside them was iron. He said they would return to her land, gather the witnesses her in-laws believed too afraid to speak, pull old documents from drawers meant to store secrets, and confront the men who thought humiliation could erase a legal truth. She listened, eyes steady on his, and in that exchange there was no illusion that the road ahead would be clean. Both understood that standing firm would invite danger, perhaps blood, perhaps loss, but also dignity, an outcome her husband would have wanted and one Silas could finally offer without flinching from the ghosts that once held him back. When they stepped outside, the wind carried the scent of rain over the basin, a scent like stone turning soft after years of drought, and Mara felt something in her chest loosen, not relief, not triumph, but a new space opening where a fear had once lived. Silas tightened the saddle straps with quiet precision, and when he helped her mount, it was with the care of a man who recognized the importance of the moment. She was no longer a woman fleeing danger. She was a woman riding toward the truth, and he was no longer a bystander to someone else's pain but a partner shaped not by pity but by the kind of respect forged when two wounded souls decide to stand rather than bow. The road into town smelled of dust and old grievances, a narrow ribbon flanked by porches and faces that had learned to read misfortune like weather. And when Silas guided the horse into the square he felt every eye tilt toward them as if people measured guilt by the way a woman sat behind a man on a late ride. Mara perched there wrapped in the coat, not cowering but small in a deliberate way, hands folded so that trembling fingers would not be visible, and the in-laws waited like a slow verdict. Clustered by the general store, their collars starched, their smiles thin as torn paper, the men with that practiced hardness in their jaw which had earlier convinced them they could remake a widow into a cautionary tale. Tension hung between the two groups as if someone had tightened a line across the street and dared any of them to cut it. Silas felt the old map of wrongs rearrange under his boots, the glare from the sisters who had spoken soft cruelties in parlors, the ledger-faced cousin who kept accounts and grudges in equal measure, the patriarch whose likeness hung in the dining room and whose voice had once been law, now reduced, in the harsh brightness of day, to a man whose power had been exercised in whispers and signatures rather than in truth. He dismounted with a movement that folded patience into purpose and led the horse to stand between Mara and the people who would try to erase her. The animal breathed slow and steady, a living buffer, while the town's murmurs sharpened into the thin music of accusation. Words were scarce and therefore heavy. When the head of the family finally spoke, it was with a measured politeness that tried to make villainy sound like concern. "We merely wish what's proper," he said, this sentence polished for public consumption. But his eyes were knives and the meaning behind his courtesy was as clear as a well-aimed brand. Martha remained behind Silas, trembling yet rooted, and for the first time she felt the difference between being sheltered and being defended. His stance was not performative. It was an active geometry that rearranged space so that anyone who tried to approach her would have to pass through him first, and the simplicity of that act said more than any speech could have. Silas answered little. His language had always been economy. He let his presence be the sentence in his silence, the paragraph that followed, a rhetorical device that carried the weight of years and the balance of consequence. He did not grin or swagger. There was no theater, only that flat, certain resolve that made men who sought trouble think twice. His eyes met the patriarch's without flinching, and in the square's dry light there passed a conversation without a single word. "You will not touch her, and if you try you will understand what it costs to be wrong." Mar found her voice then, a thin, tremulous thing at first that grew firmer with each breath. She spoke of her husband's wish, of a deed held in pocket and promise, of the way love had been used against her in drawing room calculations, and she did not beg. She asserted, quietly but with a clarity that made the in-laws' polite posture crumble into something smaller, that the land was promised to her and that erasing that promise would not be done by pageantry of shame. As she spoke, Silas watched not only the faces across from them but the town itself, the bartender who'd looked away the day rumors began, the clerk who shuffled his weight as if memory could be purchased, the few who had the courage to step forward though fear kept their shoulders low, and he divided the people into witness and accomplice, measuring where truth might be found. The patriarch tried a last rhetorical ploy, a question dressed in civility and edged with menace, but Silas answered then, in a sentence that landed flat and official, "We've witnesses. We've paper. If this is business, then let it be laid on the table." He did not raise a hand. The gesture of opening space for law and testimony was sharper than a drawn pistol had ever been. The in-laws' fury, used to quiet compliance, flared into something raw, but the town's eyes began to shift, curiosity first, then a slow making of accounts that favored fact over the old comfortable narrative of family dominance. In that charged hour, the square became a new geography, a place where shame could no longer be casually left to stand as verdict, and where a man who had once fled his own moral fracture now held steady so another might stand and reclaim what had been promised. Mara's knees trembled as she rode down from the saddle, but she stood on her own 2 feet when papers were produced and voices corroborated the small, stubborn truth of her husband's last wish. And when the in-laws finally slunk back to their den of whispers, it was not triumph that rode out with them but the recognition that the town had watched and chosen, as towns will, whether to side with the loud or the right. Silas, who had kept his past like a private weather, felt something inside of change, an old fault line settling into a new bedrock, and Mara, with coat still slung over her shoulders like a banner, understood that the moment had not freed her of the scars of that day but had given her a public space to reclaim her name. And in the hush that followed the parting of bodies and gossip, their silence together spoke of a future they would have to shape, step by careful step. The square held its breath as the standoff sharpened into a geometry of intent, Silas standing a measured step before Mara. The horses flanked a silent fence between her and the men who had once thought themselves the law of the town, and the in-laws advanced with the practiced confidence of people who had used intimidation as currency, their mouths set in the neat lines of entitlement while their hands loafed toward holsters and ledger books alike, as if both paper and pistol could do the same work. Silas did not mirror their posture with posturing. Instead, he folded patience into strategy, letting silence become a tool, watching faces foretells and letting the town's gaze become a jury one look at a time. And there, in that space carved by wind and dust, a different kind of campaign began, one built on proof, on the slow, inexorable click of community memory aligning with truth. He moved like a man who had learned the hard grammar of confrontation, not a quick flare of violence to satisfy pride, but the application of pressure in precise places, producing witnesses who'd been cowed until this moment, showing receipts and a deed that smelt faintly of an honest clerk's ink, arranging for the marshal to be called with a calm that made the tactics sound routine rather than theatrical, thus shifting the battleground from fists and faces to facts and consequence. The patriarch's smile thinned into something resembling panic as named witnesses stepped forward. Items were laid on the counter like small flags of evidence, and the men who had expected fear instead found themselves counting pockets for the courage they had assumed others lacked. They barked and blustered, trying to reframe the scene as a domestic dispute, as tradition, as anything that could paper over the ledger of greed. But each attempt snagged on a detail pulled from the town's memory, a ledger entry, a neighbor's recollection, a signature traced in the margin, and the scaffolding of the in-laws' authority began to creak. When threats slid toward violence, Silas answered not with a roar but with a measured step forward that narrowed the distance without widening the violence. The implication of force held like a card kept face down, enough to make those who relied on intimidation squint at the risk now visible to them. His hand rested near his hip, not theatrically but with the kind of readiness bred into a man who learned the cost of hesitation, and that readiness, paired with the sudden weight of community witnesses and official presence, turned the posture of the aggressors brittle. The standoff was not a movie shoot of gun smoke and swagger. It was a test of endurance and character, and slowly, inexorably, the in-laws' masks slipped. Their polite phrases betrayed panic. Their neat notes and ledgers could not refute a dozen small facts, and faces that had once looked on with cruelty either stepped back or turned away. unwilling to be part of a spectacle that now smelled of exposure. In the space carved by silence and slow motion, the patriarch made one final bluff, a last attempt to weaponize tradition into law. But Silas, voice calm and flat as a blade, offered the simplest counter: settle it with what's true, or carry your claim where the law lives. And the sentence, low and precise, cut the wind differently. The marshal's boots on the boardwalk, the town's murmur shifting like a tide, the sight of a few previously silent neighbors nodding, these small elements piled until the bluff became untenable. The men who had believed in the power of public shame found their arsenal empty. They had traded legitimacy for cruelty, and when a few of their own began to murmur that such tactics made the town small rather than safe, the retreat began, not with cinematic defeat but with the slow folding of options, the kind that happens when authority is seen for what it is, fear dressed in finery. They left, not charged across the square but driven out by the slow, steady work of truth, the kind that does not humiliate in return but exposes what was already ugly. Mara watched them go, the lines around her eyes softening with a fatigue that belonged both to loss and to triumph, and when the dust settled it revealed a different landscape, not one of triumphalism but of restoration, small and precise, her name affirmed, her right intact, and the coat around her shoulders no longer merely a refuge but a banner of resilience. Silas stood with the posture relaxed only a fraction, the old weariness still in his jaw, yet something had shifted in him as well. Where once his past had taught him to turn away, now the evidence of standing had taught him he could steady a life besides his own. The town, that mutable jury whose loyalties been like grass, had chosen, in that hour, the side of fact and dignity over spectacle and extraction. And in the quiet that followed, as people resumed their days but looked at one another differently, Mara and Silas found themselves bound not by theatrics of vengeance but by moral clarity grown from patience, planning, and the courage to make truth louder than intimidation. Justice, in the dust, small, deliberate, and irreversible enough to change the map of both their futures. The sun rose with that slow, reverent glow that makes the world seem paused between breaths, its first light sliding over the rooftops and catching on the edges of the land that was now, finally and rightfully, hers. And Mara stood in that pale gold, taller than she had been in months, wrapped in the same weather-beaten coat that had once been a lifeline in the dust but now felt like something entirely different, a symbol of her rebirth, a garment she wore not because she needed saving but because she had walked through humiliation, danger, and truth and emerged standing. Silas, a few paces away, checked his saddle with the quiet efficiency of a man preparing to move on, his posture neither expectant nor disappointed, simply shaped by years of believing that every chapter he touched ended with him riding toward the horizon alone, and the horse pawed the earth as if already anticipating the familiar rhythm of his solitary miles. Marta watched him with a mix of gratitude and something fragile but growing, her fingers tracing the coat's-worn lapel as though it were a map that led back to every moment he'd stepped between her and harm. And when she finally spoke, her voice came soft but steady, carrying the weight of choice rather than desperation as she asked him, not commanded, not pleaded, to stay, or at least not leave yet. Her words are small, trembling bridge extended into the uncertain future between them. Silas paused mid-motion, the leather strap half buckled in his hands, and the hesitation that rippled through him said more than any speech he could have delivered. This was a man accustomed to endings carved by necessity, to goodbyes carried silently over miles of open desert, and Mara's request pressed directly against the one wound he never spoke of. The fear that staying with anyone meant risking another failure, another loss lay at his feet. He kept his eyes lowered for a long heartbeat, the morning light catching the scars across his knuckles, the very scars that had once told her he carried history like a burden. And when he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, something unguarded flickered there, not fear, not sadness, but the fragile, tentative shape of hope learning how to breathe again. Mara took a small step toward him, the coat swaying around her like a banner, and she didn't offer promises she couldn't keep or paint futures in dramatic strokes. Instead, she simply held his gaze with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that strength was not loud and that companionship was a kind of courage neither of them had practiced in too long. Silas exhaled slowly, the horizon behind him brightening into warm layers of pink and gold, and he let the half-buckled strap fall against the saddle, the soft thud of leather against wood marking a decision as subtle as it was monumental. The future between them was not defined, not by law, not by expectation, not by the story the town might try to tell, but in the shared silence that followed, there existed the unmistakable possibility of something new, not a rescue, not a debt, but a partnership built from the ash-soft tenderness of two people who had seen the worst of others and still found reason to stand side by side. The horse shook its mane, the sunlight climbed higher, and the land that had been nearly stolen from her now stretched wide and golden, an open book rather than a battlefield. Silas stepped toward her, close enough that the shadows between them merged into one, and though no vows were spoken, no decisions carved into stone, the mutual breath they shared in the newborn light felt like the beginning of a quiet, powerful open loop, one that trusted the future to unfold at the pace of healing, and one that allowed hope, fragile and persistent, to rise with the dawn. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.